Everyone should be getting a notification of that the next minute or two, hopefully. And our participant numbers are growing, which is great. And so now, did you all get a notification that the recording has started? Awesome. Okay, very good. All right then. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. This is the Land Grab University's symposium, subtitled Owning the Truth and Sharing the Path to Making Amends. We have a stellar group with us today, and we're also very happy that all of you have joined us as well. At last count, we had over 650 registrants. And by email, I could see at least 35 land-grant universities, including 10 tribal colleges. So thank you all for joining us today to talk about this. I'm your host today, Steve Gavazzi. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Sciences, which is within the College of Education and Human Ecology here at The Ohio State University. We are recording this symposium, so we will be sending out a notification for people who were not able to make it or only perhaps make a part of this event. Some housekeeping includes, please use the Q&A function to pose questions specifically to panelists. There is a chat function that is enabled, but it is for audience participation, not for posing questions. Also wanted to make a quick note that this is the first of several events on this topic that we are going to be doing, and we will be sending out some notification of those future events in the not too distant future. And then finally, if you're on Twitter, today we're going to be using the hashtag LandGrabUniversities to continue this conversation throughout the day and in the weeks ahead. I want to thank a number of different sponsors who have helped us and specifically worked with the Ohio State Newark Earthworks Center to make this symposium happen. That includes First Nations Development Institute. They are our primary community partner with regards to some of the research that we're doing, which we'll briefly mention in just a moment, but also NASA, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and the Companion Journal. We're very pleased to have that co-sponsorship, as well as the Ohio State University's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. All of today's events are being funded through a grant that was done between the Newark Earthworks Center and the Ohio State University's Humanities Institute, and funded specifically by a grant from the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme. So thanks to all of you for helping out with that. Almost everything that we're going to be talking about on the Ohio State side today is connected to the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project that we're doing, and that largely means stepping out of our comfort zones and stepping up to our responsibilities as a land-grant university. In addition to myself, my partners here at Ohio State include Marty Chatsmith, who is the Associate Director of the Newark Earthworks Center, Michael Charles, who's one of our postdoc researchers connected to the Newark Earthworks Center, Casey Hoy, who represents agriculture and specifically entomology, John Lau, who is a professor in comparative studies, but also the director of the Newark Earthworks Center, and also Brian Snyder, who is the executive director of the InFact Discovery Theme. To date, the Ohio State University does not have an official land acknowledgement statement. In brief, this means that our university has yet to formally recognize the tremendous amount of territory and other forms of wealth that have been taken from Native Americans over the past several hundred years. However, there are faculty, staff, and students who are currently working to fill that gap. When this happens, and it's when, not if, Ohio State's land acknowledgement will have 4 defining features. First, we will recognize the tribes who were forcibly removed from their historic homes in service to the founding of the state of Ohio. Here, we will acknowledge that territories taken from tribes such as the Delaware, Miami, Ojibwe, Peoria, Potawatomi, Seneca, Shawnee, and Wyandot were used to build Ohio State's 6 campuses. Second, we will recognize the tribes whose land was taken, often through brute force or lopsided treaties, and then sold to raise monies that contributed to the founding of The Ohio State University. This is the central focus of today's land grab colloquium. Third, we will make certain that the land acknowledgement focuses on the past, present, and future. That is, recognizing past wrongdoings, identifying the present harm that continues to be visited upon Native Americans, and envisioning a future for Ohio State that includes engagement in ongoing dialogue and reparative activities that are associated with these injustices. Fourth and finally, we will work directly with tribal leaders to ensure that Ohio State's land acknowledgement accurately reflects the perspectives, values, and traditions of all tribal communities connected to Ohio State in all of these various ways. Of course, that means that we will not put forward a land acknowledgement until and unless our university is in direct talks with the leaders of those tribes. Fortunately, as it says here on this slide, we have received funding from the Office of President and the Office of Research here at Ohio State to begin that dialogue. And we're very happy to report that at this time, we've already had contact with 12 leaders of tribes whose land was taken and sold to found Ohio State, as well as 12 leaders of tribal colleges who serve members of those tribes as well. Our project actually is a combination of 4 different initiatives. The first one, which I've already mentioned, these are the interviews. This was largely set in motion because of the Land Grab University's report that High Country News put out. You will be hearing about that in detail today. We ourselves have received just short of $250,000 to do this work through Ohio State, but our future efforts are all going to be dependent on the availability of funds outside of our university. This first project that we did with, actually still are doing, with First Nations Development Institute will be discussed today by Mike Roberts, who is the president and CEO of First Nations Development Institute. But I also wanted to give a hat tip to Rick Williams, who could not be with us today. He is one of the primary Indigenous consultants who did the interviews for us. And again, this is focusing attention largely on those tribes whose land was taken and sold to found The Ohio State University. We also have a traditional Indigenous knowledge grant, also actually from the Global Arts and Humanities Discovery Theme Initiative, which will bring in various different artists, writers, and scholars. This is an artwork of Ricardo Cate, who recently joined us in one of our virtual colloquium. Project 3, which began in the middle of this year, focuses attention both on Ohio's historic tribes, the ones who were removed from Ohio, as well as present-day American Indians who live here in the state of Ohio. And Michael Charles, who you will be hearing from just a bit, is the postdoc researcher who is providing leadership along with John Lau and Marty Chatsmith of the Newark Earthworks Center. And then finally, the 4th project focuses on the invisibility of Native Americans in mainstream scholarship. We have assembled an interdisciplinary group of Ohio State faculty who are examining their own areas of scholarship and looking for the degree of exposure that the literature actually has with regards to Native Americans. This is funded by the In Fact Discovery theme, and you can see the various different interdisciplinary members here, including Ingrid Adams, representing the College of Medicine and College of Agriculture, myself, representing the College of Education and Human Ecology, Jennifer Garner, who represents both the John Glenn College of Public Affairs and College of Medicine, Ayaz Hyder from Public Health, Rick Livingston from Arts and Sciences, and last but not least, Jacqueline Meshlamaya from the College of Social Work. What we are really seeking to do is to embrace a both-and mission here, which is to be both land grant fierce, which I use to describe the way that we can actually look at a 21st century land grant mission around teaching, research, and engagement with communities, while still accepting the land grant truth of our founding, which is, again, the understanding that we have benefited from a tremendous transfer of wealth from Native American tribes. So in order to help me to do that, we have assembled this all-star panel. We're going to begin with Tristan AHTONE, who is now the incoming editor-at-large for GRIST. Congratulations, Tristan. And former editor-in-chief from the Texas Observer, and Bobby Lee, who is a professor at Cambridge University, and they, of course, are the primary co-authors of the Land Grab University's report. Next, we have Tsianina Lomawaima, and Tsianina is actually one of the co-editors of the Native American and Indigenous Studies special issue that was done immediately after the publication of the Land Grab University's report. Next, we will be joined by Theresa Ambo, who is a professor at UC San Diego, and she will be basically doing a really nice encapsulated version of an essay that she wrote for that special issue, but specifically focusing on the complicity and complacency of land-grant universities. Michael Roberts, who I've introduced already, will be talking more about the project to connect land-grant universities to tribal leaders. And then we will wrap up our panel by having John Lau and Michael Charles talk about the experiences of faculty, staff, and students here at The Ohio State University. We hope to save at least 20 minutes for discussion, and I see that we're already beginning to populate some of the questions and answers, so that's really fantastic. What I'm going to do now is, without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite Tristan and Bobby to begin their presentation.
Thanks for that introduction, Stephen, and thanks everybody for allowing us to be here to talk about this story today. It's really an honor. My partner, Dr. Lee, and I are going to start from the beginning and sort of give you an overview of the story, as well as the practical use of the platforms that we've built around it. And a reminder, if you like, we are using that hashtag, Land Grab Universities, to help aggregate stories. And if your thought is a little too long for a tweet, we've also got Land Grab U that we've used as well also. So there's plenty of space to sort of talk about this online. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've been told about the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But of course, as our investigation reveals, that story omits a really, really big fact. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. And in all, the Act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land for more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land, which are scattered across 24 states, making research and reporting on its impacts really, really difficult. And through our 2-year investigation, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels in order to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. Combined, those scattered parcels represent an area approximately the size of Denmark. And our reporting really provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. But it also offers opportunities for additional reporting, research, and collaboration, as we're doing here, to further the investigative work that this project has kicked off. So we'll discuss that in more detail in a moment, but I'll first turn the mic over to Bobby to talk more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
All right, thank you, Tristan. I'd like to start with 3 preliminaries. First, can everyone hear me? Tristan, can you give me some indication that people can hear me?
I think you're good.
Okay. Second, I have to apologize that I'm calling in on the phone here. There's an issue with Zoom. I'm located in the UK. I'm at the University of Cambridge, and for some reason, Zoom is not allowing in folks from the UK over this channel, which I guess I sort of understand. I don't know what's causing it, but I'm going to blame Brexit, which is causing havoc over here at the moment. The third thing is a big thank you to Steve for organizing this event. When this story came out in March 2020 and we released the website, Steve was immediately all over it, writing about it, reaching out to us about it, and eventually putting in all the work that led to this event today, and this organizing force that's going on at the Ohio State University today around the land grant, the origins of Indigenous land at land grant universities. So thank you to Steve Gavazzi for organizing this event today, and for everyone else who's put in the effort to put it together. So what I'd like to do is give you some background on the project and provide some additional detail on the historical background of the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to researching it for this story, land grab universities. Now, the indigenous sources of university land has been a major emerging issue, really only in the last few years. And really 5 or 6 years ago, the status was sort of like academic whispers. You would read snippets about it in different books, slight references to it. There was some theorizing going around decolonizing the university and settler colonial theory by authors like Rick Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who were really starting to unpack the Morrill Act of 1862 as a form of settler colonial legislation and looking at how it worked. There were some who were trying to map the parcels connected to individual schools, but it was really just not a priority or not a research focus. And where we entered, where the Land Grab Universities project entered, was to try to empirically address this issue. And now I think it's even a more exciting time to be thinking about the history of land grant universities in the wake of the past couple of years, as people have really started to talk about, to write about, to think about this issue and to organize around it in ways that we're seeing today at this event. So the project got started in 2018, and the object was to look at the history of land grant universities empirically. Now, I should say initially that land grant colleges began before the Morrill Act of 1862. Lots of state universities got grants of land in the antebellum era. This goes back at least to 1803 with federal grants to colleges of land. It goes back into the colonial period, several hundred years. Land grants of expropriated indigenous land used to create universities. But what happened in 1862 with the Morrill Act was the nationalization of the program of land grant universities centered around promoting agricultural and mechanical education for the masses that really took root in the mid-19th century as a sort of a higher education reform force. And in 1862, you have the successful enaction of this legislation, which nationalizes the program of expanding educational opportunities to the industrial classes, the lower classes, sort of agricultural workers, industrial workers. And the literature that emerged to discuss the Morrill Act, to analyze the Morrill Act's significance in American history, was couched around this idea of democracy's colleges, assessing and analyzing the extent to which they realized their goal of opening up higher educational opportunities for Americans. There was no discussion of where this land came from, how it funded the universities, and what the Land Grab Universities project was about looking at the indigenous sources of this land and understanding the Morrill Act of 1862 not as a federal donation to the states for higher education, but a federal redistribution of wealth from indigenous nations to institutions of higher education. And this isn't the only redistributive land law that's operating. In the 19th century, you have literally thousands of land laws passed by the federal government. In 1862 alone, you have 3 of the largest, the best known land redistribution laws, the Homestead Act of 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, and just a couple of days later, the Morrill Act, July 2nd, 1862. So if we go to the next slide, we should see the Morrill Act of 1862 step by step. And let me just explain to you a little bit about how the Morrill Act worked as a program, as a land redistribution program. And I should tell you that the visuals that you're seeing here, the graphics and the maps, the work of Margaret Pierce, the cartographer on the project. You'll also be seeing some photographs by Kaylin Goodluck, the photographer on the project. This step-by-step guide, you probably won't be able to read it on the screen. It's not designed to be read at this level, but it goes through sort of 5 steps that outline how the Morrill Act worked. So first, what happens is Congress offers participation in this program to all the states. State legislatures have to accept and take on the burden of administering the program, basically. The second item here is that some of this land has already been acquired from indigenous nations. Some of it is going to be acquired in the future. This is going to come sometimes through treaties, sometimes through unratified treaties, outright land seizures, executive orders. This land is going to come into the possession of the United States, and then small parcels of it are going to be plucked out and redistributed for the benefit of for raising endowments for the universities. So point 3 here is that these grants varied. They varied widely in size. The smallest were 90,000 acres. The largest received by New York State for Cornell University was 990,000 acres, almost 1 million acres. And the difference, the size was dependent on it was basically a proxy for a population of the states that was they used the congressional delegation size as the proxy for population. So larger states with larger congressional delegations got more land. That's why New York was the largest state in 1860. It receives the most, the largest allocation of land. Step 4 here, I'll go into a little bit more in a minute. There were 2 main ways in which the land was redistributed. Scrip versus land, or selecting land within the state boundaries, and I'll go into that in a moment. And then the last point here is disposal. These endowments, the land endowments, have to be sold off to create capital endowments, to create cash in the bank of the states or at the universities that can be then invested, and the proceeds can be used to help subsidize the cost of starting and running land grant universities. So if we go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more about the difference in the land redistribution process. So basically, there were 2 ways. There was a Western way and there was an Eastern way. Western states that were in areas where there was lots of public domain land that had yet to be redistributed from indigenous peoples to settlers, they were required to select with land from within their state boundaries. So what you see here is the University of California. All of the land that it acquired for its endowment was within the state of California. The same thing for Minnesota, for Oregon, Arizona. Whereas in the East, because there wasn't any public domain land, or it had been sold off. This is like in states like Ohio. They received something called scrip. Scrip was sort of like coupons that could be used to select parcels of public domain land anywhere on the surveyed public domain of the United States. So this scrip was ultimately redeemed all over the place. Here you see Cornell's scrip touching 14, 15, 16 different states. What these universities generally would do, or the states would do for the universities, is sell off the scrip in bulk and then take the cash proceeds and turn that into an endowment for the university. And then the selection process could take place over decades as this scrip was used and sold on markets. And Ohio State is a scrip state. So this is why you have their parcels. If you look at the map on landgrabu.org, this is why you have their parcels touching all over, I think 14 or 15 different states. If we go to the next slide, you can see what this looks like on the ground. You see this graphic by Margaret. This is a square mile. in Tucson, Arizona. One of the parcels that was seized from the Apache in 1886 and selected for the benefit of the state of Arizona, for the University of Arizona. And if you look at the different levels here, you can see the accuracy with which it is possible to identify these parcels. In the middle you have a satellite photo showing tract housing and sports fields within this parcel. And if you get down to the ground, you can see what is there today, which is what Kaylin Goodluck, the photographer for the project, did. Is he went around the country to get us a sense of what the Morrill Act parcel legacies on the ground looked like. And here you have the Apache Tears motel in Tucson, Arizona, on one of University of Arizona's parcels. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the full map. Now, this is the High Country News collaboration. The way that we were trying to enter into the space of rethinking the history of land-grant universities was to try to find all of the pieces of the sort of Morrill Act puzzle and to put them into a composite whole. The project's goal really was to unspool the knot completely, not just to identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state, but to locate them all insofar as that was possible. And we located more than 99% of them. We wanted to track down the indigenous origins of every single one of these parcels and gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really the critical point here, that the Morrill Act is a wealth transfer. It's not a donation. And this map that you're looking at is the result of that investigation in its most condensed form. 10.8 million acres redistributed to 47 states that funneled it into the endowments of 52 universities. Now, most of these universities are public, some of them are private. The land itself was seized, was obtained from nearly 250 tribes and nations whose land was taken by the U.S. through 162 different treaties, some of them ratified, some of them unratified, some of them these outright land takings. And when you look at how much was paid, the amount to extinguish Indian title in the parlance of the 19th century was roughly $400,000. And off of that, nearly $23 million was raised for the coffers of land-grant universities. So that's a ratio of 57 to 1. For every $1 the United States paid to acquire this land, it was able to redistribute 57 into the coffers of, into the endowments of land-grant universities. Now, these are nearly 80,000 parcels that you're looking at here, spread out across 23 or 24 states. And the means, with the land cession areas underneath them, to start to reconnect the histories of dispossession to histories of land redistribution, to move from an abstract understanding of universities as beneficiaries of conquest to the ability to tie specific institutions to specific tribal nations. Now I'll give it back to Tristan to tell us about the data online.
So one of the things that we wanted to do with this project is to make our data available to anybody who wanted to do any additional reporting or research, or even to fact check our findings. If you're not comfortable using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we really wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way. So on landgrabu.org, you have access to the same data that we were using with the same level of accuracy, and you can explore it all through a series of interactive maps and web pages. So for example, university pages like Ohio's here gives you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received, and a toggle for you to adjust amounts for inflation. It's here that you can see that nearly $341,000 raised in the 1800s roughly translates to about $6.8 million. We'll get to this interactive map here in just a moment. Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site. And on the front page of each university, you can see the tribal nations that Ohio was linked to through the Morrill Act, You'll also be able to see land cessions, acreage, etc. Again, the real gem here is the map, I think, in my opinion. Here you can toggle between solid colors or satellite maps. You can do with it, you can see all the connections between institutions and land. You can zoom in and get really, really detailed all the way down to the acre. You can fly through or even locate yourself on the map. Those crosshairs on the side there allow the website to locate you if you give it permission, and find out if you live next to one of these parcels or even on one of these parcels. You can see here, you can also check land cessions that you saw earlier to sort of toggle with the boundaries. And you also have the opportunity to check addresses. The search function at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel, or again, even what land cession it's in. So there's really a ton of information to play with here, and really allows you to explore and construct your own narratives. Like nearly everything in here is clickable, and you can spend as much time as you like exploring the data. And again, if you sort of scroll down through here and click through stuff, we offer other ways for you to really engage with the data by looking at land cessions, treaties, acreage, tribes impacted, etc. And here again is that information on tribes impacted. You can get some very quick sort of cliff notes on number of land cessions, tribal nation, acreage, the amount that US paid and the amount the university raised. And of course, there on the right-hand side, you'll see the return. So for instance, 23 times return on land that came from the Great and Little Osage. A lot of stuff to be exploring here. Essentially, when you zoom in here and you see all of the connections to the Mortalac lands, one of the greatest things you can do is you can click on those parcels as you saw before and go to the page just for that parcel. You know, essentially what Cody and Jeff have done is create thousands of pages, one for each of these land parcels, so that you can get an incredible amount of information, acre by acre, state by state, and university by university. So when we're looking at what Ohio is connected to here, you can zoom into this parcel or parcels in Gage County, Nebraska, and you can click on this particular parcel here. It comes with an ID number, comes with the number of acres, tribal nations it came from, how it was acquired, and you can click through to that page. When you click through, you can see how many acres the parcel is when it was acquired. You can see that the federal government paid the Kansas tribe $24.32 for this piece of land. And you can see that Ohio State sold it for a profit of $1,784.31. So just with this page alone, you can start to construct a story about this very specific piece of land. But because this just sort of looks like numbers and data here, we wanted to make sure that you could actually engage with the information and make sure that the site works on mobile. So you can actually go to this land, locate yourself through your phone, and go see what's on that actual parcel, which is what our photographer, Kaylin Goodluck, was doing. And this is how we know that this particular parcel that just looks like numbers and information here on the page are actually these cornfields, which was the splash page of our story in both print and web. Using this sort of technique also, Kaylin was able to figure out that in Los Angeles, the Directors Guild of America, as you can see here, was built on land ceded by the Buena Vista, the Tejon, the Uva, and 7 more tribes through an unratified treaty for the University of California. So land the US paid nothing for since they reneged on the treaty, and UC raised $788 from. We also know by going to these places and actually going to see what's there that the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery, a military cemetery in Seattle, Washington, was once Duwamish and Suquamish land. It was ceded by treaty in 1855 for the benefit of Clemson University in South Carolina State. And we also know that despite negotiating this treaty with the federal government, the Duwamish are still unrecognized by the federal government and continue to advocate for their rights guaranteed under federal law. This land was sold for about $4. those universities raised about $58 from its sale. These are just a few of Kaylin's photos, and they're quite haunting and beautiful. We really encourage folks to think about using the app in particular ways to get out there and see what the legacy of these parcels are, because there's a lot to be thinking about. And there's a lot to be inspired by, I think, by being able to actually see that information and those places. What you're seeing here is remaining lands. So there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of this reporting. Last summer, we reported that at least 16 land-grant universities, which are nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres of Moral Act lands that brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue in fiscal year 2019 alone. Utah makes for a good example. The school collected more than $1 million in fiscal year 2019 from a remaining 28,000 surface acres and 52,000 mineral acres that were obtained through the Moral Act. And when I say there's more work to be done, it's important to keep in mind that we only collected data on fiscal year 2019. So the cumulative revenue from acquisition of these lands to present at these institutions is completely unknown, and it's open for you to report and localize. That data and all of the story's data is available for you also to download on GitHub. And just so you're aware, Ohio is not one of those schools that retains any lands since it's a script school. However, I'm sure the university has other lands that you can link to tribal nations. And Dr. Lee can discuss just how to do that with the data that we've got available for you.
Yeah, thank you, Tristan. I see we only have a few minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. So I just want to say quickly, with the land grab you story, we guide you through this history with the landgrabu.org website. We allow you to sort of choose your own adventure through the data in a user-friendly way. But it was also very important to be open source on this project and to not have other researchers, subsequent researchers, reinventing the wheel. So we made all of our data available online. This is the GitHub page. If we go to the next slide, there's a user guide that says in plain English what all the fields are, how to use it. These are, if you go to the next slide, these are Excel spreadsheets for the most part. There's also geospatial data if you want to do that side of it. Just before the presentation today, I sort of went in to look at the nitty gritty for Ohio. We were able to find 97.5% of the acres, over 4,000 parcels expropriated from 110 different named tribal nations in these various instruments that took it. But I wanted to see what. I wanted to sort of ask some questions to see what could be done with some of Ohio's data. So I very quickly just, if we go to the next slide with a biographical sketch of Bryce Harper here, I asked the database who acquired most of Ohio State script, most of its Moral Act land script. And it turns out it's a man named Bryce Harper. A few years ago, trying to even answer that question, it would take you months, if not years, to figure out how to put this together. But with the database, you can pull this out in a few minutes. And then in a couple more minutes, I was able to find a picture of Bryce Harper and a biographical sketch from the 19th century that identifies him as being in the land business of holding land in the West for various taxable owners. If you go to the next slide, I was also able to find his papers at the Case Western Reserve Historical Society. Now these have things, it turns out he was a real estate, he was very into real estate business. It has his real estate licenses in there, of various other material that you could go into and start to tell personal stories about the history of Ohio State's grant. And if we go down the next slide, I also took a look at who was the second, who acquired the second most land from Ohio, from Ohio's allocation from the Moral Act, and I didn't believe what I saw at first because it's Brown University. And if you look closely at the patent here, this is the original document. This is land in favor of the state of Ohio under the Moral Act. conveyed to Brown University, which then reconveyed it to another individual. I don't know the story behind this. Brown University acquired 17,000 acres of Ohio State script. I don't know the story behind this, and that's what makes it exciting. No one really does. But with the database, you can start to ask these questions, and you can branch out on your own as a researcher or with your students, going deeper into the untold history of the Morrill Act. So I'll give it back to Tristan to say a few words about the impact of the story.
Well, I guess I want to be conscious of time here. So obviously, land-grab universities have started a public conversation on the debts that universities owe to Indigenous communities. But knowing that there are so many untold stories here just at Ohio, I think it's a good place to stop for the moment so that we can keep you all on time here. Make sure that we've got a few minutes to chat or handle any questions that you all might have.
That's great. Tristan, thank you and Bobby so much for your presentation. I'm having some technical difficulties on my end, so the timing was really great that you two took over when you did. And I, for some reason, have lost my ability to also come on video. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask Tsianina to go ahead and start to describe some of what she has been brought in to do, which is as the co-editor of the Native American and Indigenous Studies special issue. We were hoping that we would be able to get an insight into what the journal was thinking, how it manifested itself, and where it takes us to today. So thanks so much, Tsianina, for being with us.
McDonough, thanks to Steve and to all the colleagues at the Ohio State University for organizing this really important symposium on what you can all now see as this truly remarkable land-grab universities project. As Steve mentioned, I'm Tsianina Lomawaima. I'm the co-editor of NICE, the Journal of Native American and Indigenous Studies. I co-edit the journal with my colleague, Kelly McDonough, who's at the University of Texas at Austin, who had hoped and planned to be here with us today, but some family medical issues made that impossible. So I convey Kelly's thanks and greetings to you all and her apologies for not being able to join us. So earlier this year, the journal published volume 8.1, which includes an intervention section composed of 12 review essays on the LGU project, plus an interview with Tristan AHTONE and Robert Lee titled Looking Forward from Land-Grab Universities. So let me begin by saying a few words about how the journal came to publish the intervention. So NICE is the journal of NISA, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And as you can tell from the 2021 volume number 8, NICE is still a relatively new journal. The journal's first editorial team was composed of Professor Robert Warrior, now at the University of Kansas, and Professor Jeannie O'Brien at University of Minnesota. They launched the journal in 2014, and Kelly McDonough and I took over as co-editors in 2019. Among other things, research articles, for example, NICE publishes reviews, books, websites, films, museum exhibits, and so on. Across the really substantial interdisciplinary and international breadth of Indigenous studies today. That arena is so broad that very early in our tenure, Kelly and I decided to invite Robert and Jeannie to join us in what we call the Review Collective, just to help brainstorm ideas for good reviewers for all these media possibilities. So when in March of 2020, High Country News published this set of articles on the LGU project and the project's web portal with the interactive maps that you've had a glimpse of, as well as the database when all of that went publicly accessible, the four of us on the Review Collective were, what can we say? We were just blown away by the detail, the scope, the importance of the LGU project. So in April of that year, when the Review Collective got together, we were just sharing our excitement about the project, its richness of analyses, its usefulness for research and teaching, given the, the public accessibility and searchable nature of their website. And we very quickly and unanimously moved past the idea of recruiting, one reviewer for a 750-word review, which is our standard format, to the really pressing and urgent need to recruit multiple perspectives from across the interdisciplinary range of Indigenous studies to include in an intervention section. So intervention is an occasional space in the journal. It doesn't appear in every issue necessarily, but it's reserved for commentaries on events, issues, publications, and so forth of great import to Indigenous studies. Jeannie O'Brien and Robert Warrior created the intervention section, and Kelly McDonough and I have continued it. So we started to brainstorm a list of scholars as potential reviewers, scholars and practitioners, I should say, across geography, cartography, economics, higher ed, and so on. And in June of 2020, we started sending out invitations for review essays that would each be about 2,000 words on a pretty tight timeline because, we wanted the intervention to be timely, to make it into 8.1. Our submission date to our press, University of Minnesota Press, was mid-September, so we only had a few months to accomplish this. We were very, very happy to receive enthusiastic responses, and especially happy when TRISTAN AHTONE and Robert Lee agreed to contribute a concluding commentary to what ended up being 12 review essays in the intervention, and that commentary eventually took the form of an interview. So I just want to share with you the names of our authors and their disciplinary areas or interdisciplinary areas, more typically, that ended up in the published version of the intervention. Those authors include David Roediger, noted American Studies scholar at the University of Kansas, Caitlin Harvey, who was then a doctoral candidate at Princeton, who contributed a really wonderful essay placing this kind of land transfer in higher ed into British imperial and global context. Mark Palmer from geography at the University of Missouri. Marcel Brousseau in English and the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon. Randall Akey at UCLA in the Department of Public Policy and American Indian Studies, and a faculty research fellow in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Donna Fair, a research fellow at the Center for Indian Country Development in the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, as well as Department of Economics at University of Victoria. Her colleague Maggie Jones, also in the Department of Economics at the University of Victoria. Brian Brayboy, President's Professor and Senior Advisor on Native Affairs to the President, Arizona State University. Amanda Taccini from Higher and Post-Secondary Education at ASU. Judy Cortege, who's a historian at North Carolina State. Angela Gonzalez, a sociologist at Arizona State University. Alyssa Mount Pleasant from Native American Studies at the University of Buffalo. Stephen Kantrowitz, Professor of History, Afro-American Studies, and American Indian Studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our convener, Steve Gavazzi at OSU. One of the panelists today you'll be hearing from shortly, Theresa Stewart Ambo, Department of Education Studies at University of California, San Diego. Meredith McCoy, Anderson Fellow of American Studies and History at Carleton College. Rupika Risam, Secondary and Higher Ed and English at Salem State University. And Jennifer Giuliano, Department of History, Native American and Indigenous Studies and American Studies at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So we have this really rich collection of 12 essays. And I want to conclude by saying just a sincere thank you to our publisher, the University of Minnesota Press. The press, under the leadership of its director, Jason Wiedemann, has been a longtime and loyal supporter of our parent organization, NISA. And as NISA and the first editors were envisioning what and how they wanted the journal to be, the press has just been an incredibly generous and supportive partner. For example, very early on, the press agreed to publish articles, to publish content in what could be a tremendous variety of Indigenous heritage languages, as well as state languages like Spanish that are important to Indigenous peoples, and that has already begun. We've published in English, Spanish, and Quiche Maya. Looking forward to publishing in Hawaiian. The press as well has been very flexible in accommodating new or occasional series like the LGU intervention. And in conjunction with the seminar, they agreed to make issue 8.1, where the intervention occurs, publicly accessible for free through an internet link for the whole month of October. So that's accessible to all folks who've enrolled in this webinar, as well as anyone. I'll post that in the chat in just a minute. So we deeply appreciate that support and generosity from the press. And once again, we thank Steve and his colleagues at OSU for making this symposium possible today. Steve, I'll turn things back over to you.
Steve has had a bit of computer issues, so this is John, and I'm going to keep the meeting moving along. And so let me look at the agenda here. Is next would be Theresa Ambo. Yes. So Theresa, we welcome you to present today, and thank you.
Thank you, John. The always question that comes up is, can you see my screen share?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're zooming in from. I'm Theresa Ambo, and I am Lusanyo and Tongva and Tona Atam, and an assistant professor at UC San Diego in Education Studies. It's really lovely to join you all today at The Ohio State University, and all of you from across the country, from the comfort of my home and my home office that's located on my ancestral homelands, the home of the Lusanyo people who share this territory also with the Kumeyaay Nation. And I want to thank Steve for the invitation to speak today at this event. This presentation came out of a session at NISA where I made a comment in the question and answer session. And it was more of a ramble, I would say. And so but my response to the question was really about the complicity and complacency of land-grant universities, and really all colleges and universities in the US regarding the historical and continued dispossession and erasure of Indigenous people. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to turn my ramblings and passion, what some people might take in a different way, into a more concrete response. And so I do want to highlight that my remarks today are really shaped from three perspectives. First is my experience as an Indigenous woman who has lived and navigated universities in my homelands for both work and school. Second, I come to this work as an inherent learner and educator, as a former student, a student organizer, a student affairs professional, and now as a faculty and researcher who's committed to transforming education in ways that fortify tribal sovereignty. And finally, my comments are shaped by my research that focuses on the relationship between local Native nations and 3 land-grant universities in California. As attendees to this session, I am certain that you're here because you want to hear about this research, hear about our perspectives. And I think that talking about complicity and complacency can be discomforting. And that's really my purpose, is to ask people to question their complicity and complacency in higher education or in settler colonial education. And so today I'm not really here to make you feel comfortable or good about yourself. I'm really here to challenge you, to ask you to reflect on your own complacency, to help you own these truths, and to think materially about how you can make amends. And for those of you that are Indigenous or doing this work, I hope that this presentation provides you with some language to use as a tool for advocacy and work at your institution, because I know that Indigenous people are the ones that are really moving the needle forward with this work at land-grant institutions in particular. And so a few weeks ago, I attended, thanks to Steve, I attended a virtual session on land-grab universities at MIT. And in the session, Tristan made a remark that really struck me. When asked about the public's response to the article, Tristan said something to the extent of, Native people and programs at universities have responded to the article, but university leaders have not really responded. And actually have ignored requests or offered like no comment regarding the article. And so this comment is where I enter today's conversation. In the short time, I want to make 2 points and support each point with examples from my research. And so first, I'm going to speak about the tendencies of universities in avoiding their role in the unlawful and violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples. That these behaviors do not erase the complicity of universities in settler colonial education. And second, I will probe a bit at how these behaviors position universities as complacent, as willful beneficiaries to a history that has been detrimental to Indigenous land and life. And so complicity, broadly defined, is the act of being involved with others in an illegal activity or wrongdoing. And so, as mentioned, one thing that I find remarkable as well about land-grab university research is that this demonstrated, undeniable, and inextricable link between land-grant universities, the 1862 Morrill Act, and Indigenous dispossession. This research really offers an opportunity for land-grant universities to acknowledge, atone, and amend for their role in this history. I also believe that it opens up an opportunity and should compel all colleges and universities to do the same. However, this is not the case, and it's not so surprising that this isn't happening. Universities have ignored, they've denied, and they've outright refused to acknowledge their institution's role in this history, all while simultaneously and ironically professing a land grant or public university commitment to service, teaching, and research to benefit the public good. Such is the case with the lack of response that Tristan mentioned in his MIT talk by land-grant university leaders to the High Country News expose. In other instances, many of you at your own institutions might have seen this. We see universities deny and refuse such truths by arguing how or that they aren't connected to certain histories. And I have even witnessed this at my alma mater when using the land grant history as argument for providing services to Indigenous students, the university has said, and I roughly quote this, the land the university is on is neither, or was neither a scrip or a voucher given to the university under the Morrill Act. So therefore there's no obligation there. And so whether it is accepted or not, the undeniable truth is that universities are complicit. They are part of this wrongdoing. They are also condoning these events and signaling to Indigenous students and communities a disregard for their very humanity, and their education. And so certainly it's not enough to just say institutions are a part of this legacy. This is a byproduct of settler colonialism, the constant need to prove and provide evidence and do research, and not just taking at face value the fact that institutions are complicit in this, in settler colonialism. It should be the case. It should be, especially in an era of social upheaval and unrest and reckoning, but it's not. So to nuance this argument, I offer 3 additional points for consideration, and I'll turn to California as an example. And I actually think this is a great segue for some of the comments that Tristan and Bobby made regarding their research. And so the first point I want to make is that universities are entangled with a cascade or a nexus of systematic policies and practices that resulted in the disenfranchisement and dispossession of Indigenous people. In California, as an example, Indigenous people in the state encountered explorers as early as as early as 1542, and then we endured 3 colonial empires, or are enduring the third. And so we endured imperialism by the Spanish, Mexican, and US governments. Under Spanish authority, our lands were confiscated by the crown. Under Mexican authority, lands were fragmented into ranchos and granted to Mexican citizens. And then under US authority, lands were privatized and sold to US citizens. At each turn, Indigenous people endured violent and forced removal and relocation. And unique to California, we endured federal and state sanctioned and funded genocide, displacement from the gold rush, legalized indentured servitude or slavery, and treaty making, which Tristan mentioned. These treaties in California were never ratified, and they were actually in a secret session. They were hidden away for decades. These events made it possible for not just the UC, but other institutions, land grant institutions, to be given scrip or vouchers in California. And so my point here is that this history did not begin with the establishment of the US settler colonial nation, but is much more deeply seated. These events were calculated, they were strategic. And so while institutions may not have benefited from the 1862 Morale Act directly in terms of land, they continue to benefit from this cascade of events. Next, I want to argue that institutions are tied to people, and this is something that ties really great with what Bobby mentioned, but we are tied to people who committed heinous acts against Indigenous people, people who were anti-Indigenous, racist, land speculators, murderers, slave owners, rapists, the list goes on and on. Over the last decade, there have been calls by Black and Indigenous students and communities to remove monuments and rename spaces that memorialize such individuals. At universities, for example, there has been the removal of founders, faculty, and donors' names from buildings or areas on that campus. And so here is an image from UC Berkeley that I share with you, and I'll turn to UC Berkeley as an example. John, I think you're on, I can hear you.
Yes,
and so turning to UC Berkeley as an example, we recently saw the removal of Alfred L. Kroeber from a building. And so Kroeber is a founder of anthropology at UC Berkeley. And so while his efforts were not malicious, his efforts did, and the body of his work in salvage ethnography continue to be very detrimental to California Indians. In the Land Grab University expose.
Hello.
Theresa, your slides aren't advancing.
I apologize, but are you intending to advance your slides? The slides are not advancing.
Let me see. Are you seeing this or no?
It's only in the rough PowerPoint format. It's not made into a slideshow, and we're still on the first slide.
There we
I'm
go.
sorry, everyone. Let me see if I can get this again.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're fine. I appreciate can you see this now?
No. Can't see anything now.
And now?
No.
Your screen is off.
No.
Do you have to hit share screen again?
Probably. Very sorry, everybody.
Okay, and then
We can see that.
Can you see this?
Yes.
yes,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that.
no problem. Thank you.
Okay. And so this Zoom platform can kind of be discombobulating. And so I was talking about Alfred Kroeber. And so Alfred Kroeber, although he was a founder of the anthropology department at UC San Diego. And so while people have noted that his efforts were not malicious, his body of work had detrimental impacts on California's indigenous people. Not only did Alfred Kroeber declare a number of California Native nations extinct, which has been a real impediment to federal recognition, but he also, and this was in the Land Grab University's article, he put in live display what he dubbed the last living person of a particular tribe, Ishi, as a live exhibit for people to come visit. And it really perpetuated and contributed to this narrative that California Indian people, but also indigenous people in general, we're a dying and vanishing race. And so my point here is that institutions and departments undoubtedly were established by individuals that committed deplorable acts against indigenous people, acts that continue to have ramifications into today. And so finally, I want to talk about monies given to found and finance these institutions and how they are tied to stolen wealth, not only through the Morale Act, but calculated efforts such as removal policies, genocidal campaigns, and real estate schemes that removed indigenous people from their land. I encourage you all to turn to the work of Craig Stephen Wilder, who meticulously examines the connection between colonial colleges and chattel slavery, specifically accounting for money from slave owners that financed early colonial colleges. And so likewise, I would turn you all to Hastings Law School and Stanford University in California. In 1878, Syrianus Hastings donated $100,000 to found Hastings Law School in San Francisco. Similarly, Leland Stanford donated $20 million to found Stanford University. Both of these benefactors were responsible for leading the assembly, legislation, financing, and state sponsorship of militia campaigns against California's indigenous people. The Stanfords, the family, and Leland and his wife specifically, built their fortunes off of real estate. They profited from the theft of indigenous land that later benefited the development of a prestigious private school or private university in the West Coast. And so I find universities to be implicated in the erasure of indigenous people. Their denial and refusal to acknowledge these truths demonstrate that they are condoning these events and these individuals' action. And so before closing and talking more concretely about what institutions can do, I want to briefly talk about complacency. And so we all are complacent in settler colonialism, meaning that we all are satisfied with this current situation and living and existing in a settler colonial society. And for some of us, we can be unconcerned at times with changing it or making it better. And so as of late, there has been this uptake of land acknowledgement practices, which is deeply ironic because universities are still denying this full and true history. And so from your position as a student, as a staff, as a faculty, as a leader, as a community member, as an indigenous person, I call on you to consider how you have been complacent. I also call on you to consider what you can do from your position, be it as an individual or at an institutional level, to make amends. And then I want to close today by offering some tangible and concrete ways to think about what we can do to make amends with indigenous people. And so first, I acknowledge that there are people doing this work at universities across the country. In comparison, this is a fraction of a fraction, but important work nonetheless. And so that said, this work is typically being done by Native people or programs and not institutions. And so these recommendations are something that I really offer for institutions and I hope can be useful. And so I would argue that it is really essential for institutions to understand and acknowledge their history by conducting deep historical institutional investigations. In addition to the work of Craig Stephen Wilder, I also point you to the work of the John Evans Study Committee at Northwestern, which investigated the connection of their institution's founder to land acquisition. And there's also work emerging out of the University of California by myself, Dr. Heather Daly Ponchetti, Kelly Stewart, Alexandria Hunter, Eva Trujillo, Juan Reynoso, and Kenneth Ramos, who are all community members, Indigenous California or California Indians from the Tongva and the Kumeyaay Nations. And together we're leading a UC-wide initiative that examines both the temporal and spatial histories of the UC campuses across all waves of settler colonialism in the US or in California. And I would add that I do not believe this research should be done to find an excuse or an alibi, but to paint an accurate and true history and true accounting of this history. Institutions, once they have a better understanding of their history, I would encourage them to atone for their involvement in this history and their complicity over the years. And so to be clear, I do not see this as a matter of absolution or forgiveness. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. It's not over, it's ongoing. And so this isn't something to just, once it's done, the institution can move on with its usual business. I also argue that institutions need to materialize commitments to Indigenous people. And in some of my work, I point out that arguably Indigenous people have contributed more to higher education per capita, all while receiving far fewer benefits. Universities need to see and engage Indigenous people as stakeholders, give local Indigenous communities a seat at the table on system-wide governing boards to ensure that the needs of Indigenous students and communities are identified by Indigenous people, and we aren't taking a paternalistic approach to serving Native students and communities. And finally, none of this would be possible without meaningful engagement and respectful relationships. I think universities need to move away from this idea of mutuality and the idea that we could equally benefit from this relationship, and the work can and should really be rooted in what I call tribal university relationships and partnerships. And so I count this as external economic, curricular, or co-curricular relationships existing between Native nations and universities that in fact recognize, reinforce, and respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And I will end there.
Okay, thank you, Theresa, for a powerfully articulated and thought-provoking presentation. And so we will move on to our next panelist, Michael Roberts, First Nations Development Institute. And the title of his talk is Connecting Universities to Leaders of Tribes Whose Land Was Taken and Sold to Fund Land Grant Institutions. And so, Michael, are you there?
Yes. Thank you, John. Gunasheshiak. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Michael Roberts. I'm the president and CEO of First Nations Development Institute, a 41-year-old racial and economic justice organization working with tribal nations and tribal communities throughout the United States. I wanted to start my talk today by noting that pre-contact, there was probably the estimates are that there were between 4 and 18 million natives inhabiting North America. By the time the Morrill Act passed in 1862, the census put that number at about 350,000. And by the time that the Ohio State University received their script from the Morrill Act in 1870, the number was down to about 250,000. Now, I believe that United States genocidal practices are important to looking at the land theft from tribal nations. In fact, when we look at the causes, as Theresa was able to point out, of this genocidal action, it included things like disease and massacres, enslavement and exploitation, but even more consequential than warfare and mistreatment of indigenous populations were the geographic displacement and disruption to lifeways that resulted from European colonization of the Americas. this is, wasn't just a benign and passive act. When you look at the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Congress appropriated $500,000 to President Jackson for the removal of Indians. At the end of that campaign, the United States has spent more than $75 million to remove Indians from the United States and from the eastern territories of the US. If you look at that in today's dollars, that's more than $1 trillion from the US public coffers to remove Indians. So this was a very specific and very deliberate act of land theft. And it's no wonder that when we look at some of the practices and the acknowledgement that happened during the 1860s, 1870s, there was, as Theresa pointed out, a real belief that this was a vanishing race, a disappearing peoples. At 250,000 and following, I can't, it's easy to understand why universities and the people who were taking this land understood it to be, there would be no consequences for their actions. A couple of weeks ago, there was a lecture series at Cornell University, and Dr. Meredith Parker gave a great talk on this very subject of land-grant universities. And I was, very much caught by one of her quotes, and I'll try and read this without too much poor public speaking technique. The Morrill Act in the end took 10.7 million acres, which had been variously and often violently seized or duplicitously obtained under conditions of extreme duress from hundreds upon hundreds of indigenous tribal nations by the United States government, and used to create seed money for the new federal program of higher education around architecture and around agriculture and mechanical arts. I will say that is under this duress that more than 500 treaties that tribal nations signed with the United States that happened between 1778 and 1871. And it's important to note when you look into these treaties that they were binding contracts, enumerating that in exchange for huge swaths of lands, millions of acres, tribal nations would be guaranteed healthcare, housing, and yes, important to this conversation today, education. It also needs to be noted that the United States has since violated in some way or broken each and every one of these more than 500 treaties. And we see that today, that the land grant universities were the beneficiary of these broken treaties. I think that backdrop really sets the stage for my organization's participation in this project. The Stepping Out and Stepping Up Racial Justice Project. And the project, in my mind and the mind of my organization, fits at least tangentially into our 40-year rubric of economic and racial justice for Native American people. We were first introduced to this project through a friend of mine, Brian Snyder, from the Ohio State Food and Agricultural Transformation Project. And I was immediately taken by the conversations and the vision of Dr. Stephen Gavazzi, that Dr. Gavazzi was acknowledging that while creating hubs for higher education may have seemed noble, the truth that the parcels granted to state governments were from territories taken from American tribes, typically by brute force or lopsided treaties, and that we can track the present day value, according to the Land Grab University's report, to more than $500 million. From our perspective at First Nations, this is a project worth pursuing. At least it caught our interest in our larger racial and social and economic justice mission. Dr. Gavazzi went on to be quoted in a magazine article in Forbes, that recognizing violence and atrocities behind the land seizures of the nation's land grant universities is the first step to righting the historic and ongoing wrong. And this involves contrition and a call for remorse and apology. Those are pretty powerful words. And I think that, you know, the speaker who preceded me here today, Theresa, had a lot to say about universities choosing to ignore and refute where their land came from and where their origination stories began. I'll say this, some of the things that were really compelling to First Nations in this project were, one, that it was a relatively simple project in its design. We know that these universities, including the Ohio State University, were created from these land scrip parcels that were sold. You know, Ohio State itself was created with $340,838. I know that number because I've been trying to figure out the present value of that dollar in a bunch of different ways. I think that all the universities involved should look at what the net present value of those dollars can. I'm guessing that most of these universities have, even some of these land grant universities have well-established economic and business schools who can do that calculation for them. If not, I think there's probably some Indian folks who could probably help them along in that process. But the project itself is relatively simple. You know, we were trying to figure out how the Ohio State could go beyond the cursory land acknowledgement sentiments and engage with tribal nations whose lands were used as seed money for the Ohio State endowment. And this may sound fairly simple, but in fact, none of the 52 land grant institutions had ever engaged with the tribal leaders whose land was stolen. And so that is what we set out to do. From there, the process was fairly straightforward. It was to identify the tribal nations whose land benefited Ohio State. While on the surface, that was a fairly simple idea. The land grab universities report enumerated who those folks were. More complicating that a bit was that in some cases, some of the tribes and bands whose land had been taken are no longer in existence or have been contracted into other tribal nations. And so there, a little bit of work on our part had to go to just identifying who the folks whose land was taken for the Ohio State University's endowment were. And we came up with a list of 100+ tribes. And the next part of that process was really to create a survey instrument to talk to tribal leaders. And our goal really was to talk to the governmental representatives of those tribes, tribal chairmen, tribal councils, who could speak with authority from the interests of the tribes. And then thirdly, just really to deploy those surveys and get those interviews and engage those tribal leaders in a conversation, or at least beginning of a conversation, about the impact of the land grant university process and the Moral Act. And as you might expect, the devil is in the details, right? That, you know, like I said, identifying these folks and find contact information for the many tribes, even for someone like First Nations who's been in this business for 4 years, proved a bit challenging. But fortunately, First Nations and the project really benefited from a long-term relationship that First Nations enjoyed with Richard Williams, Noglala, Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne tribal member, who had a nationwide and, more importantly, a Indian countrywide network from his 20 years of running the very successful American Indian College Fund. So Rick had both contacts from his previous leadership position at the College Fund, as well as just a real long-term intellectual curiosity about the education process and access to education in the United States, especially when it comes to Native American folks. In Rick, we found an investigator who was well-connected, but more importantly, genuinely interested in the underlying economic and racial justice intents of the project. And so through hundreds, if not thousands, of professional and personal emails, letters, texts, phone calls, and even in-person visits, Rick did the yeoman's task of putting the survey instrument into the field and talking to tribal leaders. And I cannot understate Rick's importance in the success of this project today. So you're probably wondering, like, what did we learn from our conversations with tribal leaders? And I'll share some of our findings with you right now. First of all, we found that in many instances, the history of the Morrill Act wasn't really well known. You would think that as an Indian tribal leader, that folks would be a little bit more aware of the Morrill Act. You have to understand that this wasn't the only act of land theft by the United States of Indian land. And you also have to understand the complexities that tribal leaders have to face on a day in, day out basis, where they're responsible for everything from protecting their tribal sovereignty and engaging with the US government, and also playing the role of local dog catcher or food bank operator. But what was frequently noted by these tribal leaders was not so much their knowledge of the Morrill Act, but their keen awareness of the many treaties that the tribal nations had signed with the United States government that were oftentimes unfairly negotiated and never enforced or enacted or ratified, and oftentimes broken. Actually, not oftentimes, always broken. Two, the tribes who responded were aware that there had never been, in their minds, an economic assessment of the impact of the Morrill Act. So in their minds, no one had ever done the math to see what the true loss for American Indian tribes and nations were, and what the benefit was. Not until this land-grab university report had anybody put an economic number to that dispossession. Three, tribes were keenly aware that the Indian Removal Act and similar acts, as noted earlier, the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Dawes Act, the Morrill Act, all these were, tribes were keenly aware that these acts by Congress had huge impacts on the long-term well-being of tribes and the dispossession of their assets. And also, these tribes noted the impacts on their tribe's ability to sustain agricultural production, access traditional foods, and access important and sacred sites. Fourth, no tribe had ever experienced a public acknowledgement or apology for the taking of these lands by the university who benefited through the Morrill Act. They also noted that the fashionable practice of land acknowledgement, as noted by Theresa earlier, should not be mistaken for acknowledgement or apology. That the more acceptable and appropriate action would be reparations. Fifth, not surprisingly, the effects of the removal and theft of millions of billions of dollars in real assets are still experienced by tribal citizens today. The marginalization of Indian people and Indian tribes is not caused by the tribes themselves, but caused by decades, if not centuries, of deliberate policies for the genocide and theft of Indian lands and Indian people. And finally, when asked what institutions like The Ohio State University could do to repair the harms caused by the taking of these territories, the answers were pretty similar across, if not all, but most of the participants included. And first of all, I think that the overriding sentiment by these tribal leaders was just return the damn land, right? Though I think that, in saying that, I think that the recognition of the realization that that probably won't happen is also a belief, though hope has not been dashed, that there might be some possibility for land repatriation to many of these tribes. Secondly, they wanted these universities to accept responsibility, acknowledgement, and even an apology for this land theft that benefited these institutions. Thirdly, the tribes and tribal leaders thought there should be real tangible benefits to the tribes and their citizens, including the possibility of scholarships and tuition waivers by these institutions. And lastly, and not unwarranted, and not to trivialize this, but these tribal leaders really believe that there should be a teaching of history by these institutions and a plea for that honest and forthright education for non-Indians. And they thought this would be an appropriate and recognized response. Since our involvement in this project with The Ohio State University and the Stepping Out and Stepping Out projects, First Nations has received a handful of other requests to partner with other land grant universities. And while this project might have been a bit tangential to our mission or core, I believe that our principal investigator, Rick Williams, and First Nations might be interested in having more real conversations about the expansion of this work. We really think that there is some more conversations to be had about linking beneficiary universities with tribal nations whose land have been appropriated. I know that we are a little bit pressed for time, and I wanted to make sure we move on the agenda, but I just wanted to say, Gunashesh, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate your valuable contribution to both all what we're doing, what you're doing, but also with your presence today. Much appreciated. According to the schedule, the next up is we're going to talk about faculty and student experiences at Ohio State University. And we're going to start first with Michael Charles, who is Dene, Dr. Michael Charles, I should say, recent graduate of the Ohio State University, and we're excited he's for this year a postdoc at the Ohio State University too. So he has multiple hats and perspectives, perhaps, from which he can speak. And so I'll turn it over to Michael first to share with you sort of what's his experience been like here at Ohio State.
Sure. Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of start with the idea that I think for many of us, especially in Ohio, where there's not a huge Indigenous population around us, is it's very common to be the only Native or only Indigenous person in the room. And I think that becomes even more common as you enter into different STEM fields. And that was kind of been the case in my kind of education ever since leaving home. And I think what starts to happen a lot of times is something that Theresa actually brought up, in which she said, basically, most of the people doing this work are the Indigenous people that are bearing the work for representation, for making stories heard. And it's not usually the university that's really supporting that. And I think that's something that often happens. And I think it's very common when you are the only Native person in the room, where everyone wants you to kind of come up and speak or represent all Indigenous people, whether it's organizations for a panel or by signing a letter or a petition. It's very easy to kind of become the token Native. And I think as Native people, when you're put in that position, it becomes challenging to understand, when do I need to say no for my own well-being and schedule, and when do I need to say yes as well, knowing that if I'm not there, there might not be another Indigenous voice. And so I think that's something that is a huge struggle. And a lot of this isn't necessarily particular to Ohio State or even land grant universities, but it can be very common. And I will also say my undergrad was also at another land grant university, where I was at Cornell, where I've seen many old friends and mentors in the chat have been chiming in. So it's good to see you all as well. But I think one thing that's really particular about Indigenous people, and something that has been instilled in us, whether it's through family or culture, is that we usually are really good at finding our communities. And so that's been a huge part of my experience, both at Cornell and at Ohio State. I was very lucky when I was a freshman at Cornell as an undergrad to go live in an all Native dorm, a Guego that they have there. And that really showed me the value of what it meant to find a community. And kind of no matter how much I struggled, I kind of knew there was other people like me, that were also struggling, or who had similar stories, or even just knew how to joke and relax in similar ways. And I think there's just something different about the culture and the social culture of Native people that really does transcend across tribal boundaries. But one thing's for certain is that we definitely know how to laugh, and we definitely know how to eat food around a table. And so I think that's where a lot of my community has been built across every city I've ever lived in, every school I've gone to. And I think that's where most of the support has come from, is being able to navigate these institutions with other people. And I think it was really special at Cornell, where they did a lot of relationship building between students and faculty member. They did their faculty fellows dinners, where it was a chance for a free paid dinner and meal just to go meet and hang out with other Native students, other Native faculty and staff. And at Ohio State, it was similar, where we had the Native OSU at the Multicultural Center, where you could stop in, you could meet students, kind of find people along all different tracks. And one thing I will say is the higher you get in your steps of education, I think the more alone it can feel, especially as graduate students. I think through my whole time here, we had basically the same 3 or 4 people in our program, in our Indigenous graduate student group. And it was basically the same group just going on from year to year. And luckily we were all within a year or 2 of each other. So we kind of all started and all ended around the same time, but now it's been hard to find more students to pass on an organization or to really keep the community there. And that's what gets scary, is when there's not an existing community for new students to tap into. And again, it all of this comes down to Indigenous peoples doing the work, finding each other at the university, and really trying to build these communities on their own. And I think another thing to think about is the communities that exist outside of the university. And I think that is one thing that can be a struggle to find. And I think I've never really seen much of formal university relationship building to make sure those connections exist. Yet I think those have played a huge role in my experience. And I think so at Ohio State, it's been the local Indian Center here in Central Ohio. And you kind of had to go in and find it yourself, or you kind of hear about it, but find an invitation in, so you just kind of have to show up. And I remember one thing that was pretty special at Cornell was the Ataguego and the American Indian program helped us connect with actual local Cayuga tribal leaders. And so we got to meet and have talking circles with tribal leaders. And in a lot of ways, it really felt like we could continue being Native and practicing Native ceremonies and just kind of being around the culture, even if it wasn't in a lot of official ways. It was just in a lot of just kind of embedded in your social circle. It was something you got to keep talking about and sharing your culture. And I think that's really important for Native students. And I think that's the biggest way to help us not feel like the only person in the room. And so I think that's something that universities need to keep trying to do, is building these connections that they can actually tap their students into, and making sure there are strong communities on campus. And that includes making sure there are Native students on campus through concentrated recruitment efforts as well. But I think I'm sharing this time with Dr. Lau, so I'll pass it on to him right now to talk a bit more about the faculty experience.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very good to hear your perspective and your experiences here and at Cornell. Yeah, I'll just take a few minutes. So again, I'm John Lau. I'm an associate professor at the Ohio State University. I teach at a regional campus about 35, 40 miles to the east of the main campus, the Newark campus of OSU. And I've been here almost 10 years. I want to, I guess it's a part of, I don't know, that's a part of Complicity, but No, I do want to acknowledge that I appreciate Ohio State for giving me employment. Right, that's important to get not just me, although in some self-serving way, I'm glad I have a job. I wish all Native scholars had jobs, but I know that isn't the case. So I'm blessed to have a job, and that they took a chance with me. So overall at Ohio State, I've experienced the things that are going on here, which is, there's a crisis in student enrollment. There's a crisis in faculty, Native faculty hires, and there's a crisis in programming in our American Indian Studies minor. And there's a crisis in our funding of the Newark Earthworks Center, an academic research center that I'm director of, that is connected to the Hopewell era ancestral sites here in what's now called Ohio. This has been I'm the only Native faculty at the Newark campus. There's a person of Choctaw descent that is a senior lecturer. That's the only other faculty person on the entire campus. I have one staff person that is Choctaw, Marty Chet Smith. And we're pretty well disconnected from the main campus in a lot of ways. The good news is that Ohio State has a lot of space to go upwards. If they're willing to make a commitment to doing so, there were 40 plus tribes that are historic to Ohio. They could start with tuition waivers for those students. They could start with target hires. Our chair of our American Indian Studies minor program is retiring next year. We need a senior lecturer or a senior faculty person to replace that person. I'm not going to be here forever as director of the Newark Earthworks Center. We need a senior faculty person to be replacing me. And we need across arts and sciences, both in the humanities and in STEM, we need faculty. When I went to school and I have 5 college degrees, I chose the schools not because they had a Longhouse or they had a Native American support program or they had an AIS minor. I have to be honest. I chose the schools because I connected with the Native faculty person there. And I think that that's not recognized enough by the university or others connected with the university that we really need to get some Native faculty here. I do appreciate the work that we're doing. I get to work with Steve Gavazzi, Michael Roberts, Michael Charles, Rick Williams, Casey Hoy, Fred Snyder, through grants. And so there's been a little money that has been doled out, but perhaps we can light a spark. And that's generally in my teaching what I look for, and I'll close with this, is that I teach almost no Native students, which is odd for me because I've been up in Minnesota, I've been in Michigan, where there are tribes. There are no tribes in Ohio. My tribe is Pokagon Potawatomi, 400 miles away, the closest tribe to Ohio State. But I teach a lot of non-Native students, and I'm oftentimes the first Native person they've ever met. They think of mascots and TV stereotypes, and that's it. And so I get to plant a lot of seeds, and I think that's important work. But we need the university to acknowledge its obligations to Native peoples, that it wouldn't exist. None of this would exist but for the sacrifices of Native peoples. And so I'll close with that. Thank you. So now I think Steve is going to try to get back on. Steve, were you able to get back on?
I'm on at least.
Okay. So I believe we were going to turn this over now to a conversation or question and answer. And did you want to help facilitate that, Steve?
I sure can. My only problem now is that since I just joined, I don't have access to the questions that had been posed prior to my coming back in. So perhaps I could get someone's help in terms of reviewing some of those.
Are you referring just to the Q&A that's here in the Zoom?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can start with some of them. Let me start. So one question that came up is, how are OSU and other land-grant universities thinking about addressing the relationships between these distinctive histories? Which I think we've started to touch on, at least from what we think should happen. So I don't know if anyone has thoughts from if there are any actual plans in motion besides the work and research that has been brought up already.
Well, we certainly know, and I think that Bobby Lee, hey, good to see you on screen finally. Thanks for being here. I know that Bobby and Tristan, you've been in contact with lots of different land-grant universities across the country. So perhaps you could speak to some of the efforts that you've seen at other universities?
You want to start, Bob?
Yeah, no, I'll start, and this is some of the, I guess, the material that got clipped off at the end when we were pressed for time and we were talking earlier. But yeah, we have spoken with a lot of universities, and there's been a sort of a groundswell, as someone mentioned earlier in the presentation. It's come mostly from Native students and faculty at universities that have reacted to the story, less so from administration at universities. So we've seen Cornell organize the Cornell and Dispossession project, really this project here. So I'm eager to hear what the next steps are for you. It seems to be out in front in terms of organizing. Next week, we're going to be talking at Connecticut, at University of Connecticut, that has started a project called Land Grab Yukon, and is going to be launching it this month. The last I heard, they were interested in developing a new Indigenous student center there. I don't know if their plans have changed. We've spoken at Texas A&M that is doing some organizing, and then we've seen some changes like the rewriting of land acknowledgements at Washington State University, and a lot of informal action, forming of committees. We've seen student protests. I've corresponded with a student at the University of Missouri who was putting together a research project and was able to get some funding to do that, to look deeper into the school's program. I should also mention that the Yukon program was really spearheaded by students who were leading the way there in organizing this Land Grab Yukon event that's going to be next week. So we've seen it really from the student level, from the faculty level, starting to organize.
Thanks, Bobby. And we've been in contact ourselves with no less than 17 land-grant universities, many of whom, Bobby, you mentioned. but there are also others out there as well. And I do think that there's a clamoring for some sort of united front, some way to begin to understand what lessons have been learned in terms of these different efforts, as well as figuring out whether or not there's strength in numbers. If in fact we need to get beyond just the one-offs that each university might do and begin to say, is there something that we can do in a much more coordinated way? And so there are a number of different avenues that we can explore. Some universities are pushing really harder on that than others, but our hope is that we would find some early adopters and then be able to just develop that energy, that synergy, and move forward in a way in which other land-grant universities would find it difficult to not be involved over time. Michael, what else did I miss? I see some of the more recent ones coming in, but are there others that we need to look at as well?
Yeah, I tried to organize a few of them just on my own machine, but I think one that's an important thing. I don't know if we really will have an answer to this, but it's a very, I think it's a really good posing thought. Was the question was, I would also love to see some type of map that identifies how much academic institutions receive to conduct research with/for tribal nations. So basically how much of their wealth and reputation is still built on their research proposals and work within Native nations.
Yeah, that's actually very excellent. And part of that speaks to the need for some sort of national clearinghouse on these activities. And that clearinghouse could include the accounting of that kind of money that's being put forward to these kinds of efforts. So it wouldn't have to be just a clearinghouse for efforts, but also a clearinghouse that could show relative resources. So, and I see someone in the chat saying Extension Foundation, and that's exactly the model that we are thinking of using, is what has already been built out by the Extension Foundation, to at least begin to look at what are the partnerships that are happening between 1862 and 1994 organizations, and whether or not that gives us some clue about the degree to which these efforts are already being undertaken. So that was a great point that I saw just put up in that chat.
Also within that chat right after too, and I saw it show up in the questions, is has there been any meaningful response to this from APLU, or have they gotten involved?
That's a good question. We have APLU represented today. So there are several members, several senior leaders who are working within the organization, and we have been in dialogue with them about the, among other things, a grant that we would like to put into NIFA, the National Institutes for Food and Agriculture, that would bring 1862 and 1994 land grant leaders together to talk about partnerships, more specifically in this case around food sovereignty and food security issues. But again, that would build a platform out for other opportunities down the road that would be larger than just food.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I guess we should also say that while APLU is an important component of that, it also really needs to be driven by Falcon and AHEC, right? The American Indian Higher Education Consortium, which is also a part of this. And we're really, our hope is that we can potentially connect this kind of work to the Falcon conference, which is actually this year will be virtual again. It was supposed to be in Kansas City, but next year will be in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so our hope is that we can perhaps do a one-day pre-conference there that would bring 1862 and 1994 organizations together to do that exact kind of, to have that exact kind of conversation.
Awesome. And this one I think is a good one to just kind of have a more general discussion on. So I'm going to bring this one up next. This is kind of just on the point that that Theresa and I talked about too, of how a lot of this work falls on Indigenous shoulders. And so this question is, how can non-Indigenous people and scholars initiate this work or take on the burden of responsibility in an ethical way without centering non-Native perspectives? And that's a very great question. But I'll see if anyone else wants to tackle this before I share any thoughts.
I would say, if I can, ask that very question to Indigenous people at your institution.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I'll kind of piggyback where one of the things that I think is most important is actually building meaningful relationships with the Indigenous people around you and in the school if you know them. And I think that's where, when I have worked with non-Indigenous people on Indigenous work, that's where I feel most comfortable and safe bringing them in and giving them roles that we see. I think without the relationships, you can kind of just do the best you can. But I think one of the things is to just see where, I mean, when it comes to even organizing things or if you are going to have a platform for speakers, taking on some of the more, I mean, logistics and doing any of the other work you see, or tapping in wherever, if you have a multicultural center anywhere where there's student groups, just kind of bringing that in and just building those relationships, I think, is the start. But as Theresa said, it's going to depend where you are and who you're with. And as Madison Eagle also pointed out, nothing about us without us. Okay, we'll go to another question. This one is Ohio State specific, but I mean, there also might be examples at other schools. Does Ohio State have scholarships for Native students and graduate students? And what is the responsibility of state legislators in this story? Noting that a lot of these universities are also state universities.
You know, it's interesting, Michael. I know more about what other universities offer in comparison to what Ohio State offers, but there are a range of opportunities at other land grant universities specifically, as well as states, entire states. The state of Maine comes to mind, where they offer scholarships to any tribal member who is actually not only connected to a historic tribe in Maine, but also, if I'm remembering correctly, to Canadian tribes as well. So I don't know if that's the gold standard, but certainly I think that those are models to follow, both at a university level and at a state level as well, if people are really serious about this. But Michael, were you ever offered anything as a Native American student that you're aware of?
Not for Ohio State. I just did the same pipeline that everyone else did in trying to get the NSF grants. So that's the way I went. I do know a lot of schools that have relationships specifically with our tribe, Navajo Nation, back home, where they have different ways. So if you're a Navajo Nation citizen, you can actually get in-state tuition at any of the 3 states that our reservation crosses. And I know there's also some schools like Fort Lewis that have specific scholarships and things like that. But most of what I know comes from organizations like the American Indian, I think it's the Graduate Center or Council, and ACES. There's a lot of other ways to do it, but I don't know a lot of them that are directly through a university.
Great, thank you. John, do you know?
No, but I see that Madison Eagle's on, or she was a minute ago. I'm wondering, Madison, do you know? I'm not sure if you would talk, but can you put it in that function?
Yeah, she put it in the chat, John. So it does look like there's an American Indian Student Services Development Fund through the Multicultural Center, and there's a fund number, and there's a website that she's given a website address to, which is great. And Madison goes on to say, yes, we do have one scholarship that is connected to an endowment fund, which is that's good to know. Michael, I'm recognizing there's probably a lot of other questions, but we have less than a minute left. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to turn this back to Tristan and Bobby and ask you, you're now a year and a half out from when you first did this report. And of course, this work is continuing, but I'm wondering if you both might have some parting thoughts to share in terms of where you see this work going from this point forward, given everything that you've heard today. Any thoughts about important next steps or important thoughts to keep in mind?
I mean, I can start, and then Tristan can bring us out. I would say, I mean, when we were working on this, from project and releasing it, one of the things that we had figured out was, even though we had spent, years on this, how little we knew and how much more there was to find out about the Morrill Act and how it transformed higher education. You saw in one of the slides, we looked at 1 year of the income from remaining lands that have yet to be sold through the Morrill Act. We often get asked what's next for you, and I think really the issue has always been for us to try to encourage others to build off of this project. It can't just be a single research group. It is so massive. It involves so many universities. I see questions here about its connections to things like land and sea universities and places like the University of Alaska that were left out of our analysis. We are just really, we're a year and a half in to publishing this, but we're still just at the very sort of tip of the iceberg here. There's so much more to find out. And I don't think there's going to be change on this issue, and I don't think we're going to have a full appreciation of the extent of the Morrill Act's impact on higher education and land grants' impact on higher education unless it is many researchers at many universities engaging many students in these questions. So the next steps, hopefully, isn't just for Tristan and I, but it's for all of us to think about where we can take this work next.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The reason that we're here discussing this right now, or have discussed this at any other institution, is because of interest and pressure from faculty, staff, and students to make sure that this is being addressed. So I guess all I can offer here, on top of what Bobby's already said, is encouragement as well. That the more people that are looking at this, talking about this, and thinking about this, it does have a lot of possibility to make real change at institutions. We've heard quite a bit about both what more support for Native students, which is really great. But I think one of the things that we can also be thinking about too is what are the curriculums and things that land grant universities are teaching. In addressing this history, is the history going to be used to make a better, more perfect land grant constellation of schools, or is this information going to be used to build classes and curriculum that really thinks about what justice can be on the other end of this? Because in my opinion, free tuition is kind of just the start of this. I think what we're really talking about more is how are we thinking about the status quo, and how are we going to continue to challenge that status quo? Because again, having administration behind this symposium is fantastic. Hearing that you've got folks from the APLU on this call is great. They're here because of the pressure that y'all have put on them. And that's important to keep in mind, is that your actions can make those differences, but it's a long fight. So thank you again for the invitation to be here and to talk about this.
The gratitude is all ours. Thank you so much for your work. You've left us with some great questions that really are going to be up to each of us as individuals to have input in the answer and what that's going to look like down the road. So thank you to everyone, to all the participants who hung with us throughout some of the little bit of glitches. I think that this was enormously successful on so many different levels. Thanks again to the all-star panel. You all really made this happen. Just a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And we're not done with that, even here within the grant. We have other events that we are going to be scheduling down the road. We will be following up. This was recorded. We know that other people will be watching this when they're actually going to be able to. And I know that there will be a lot of additional questions and conversations that will be raised. So we will be in touch with all of the participants, and we will also be obviously in touch with panelists as well to coordinate and move forward. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate all of the work and all of the effort. Take care.